She was abducted, strangled, and dumped in the outdoors.
When you have a young person that dies, it's shocking.
That day was the end of my life. I had nothing to put dinner on.
They were good suspects because they were close to the victim's family.
His girlfriend heard him say, "She wouldn't do me, so I did her."
It was disheartening. It's been right here. Why haven't we done anything?
We still have the grand jury. We have time. Let's follow this to the end.
Grand Rapids, Michigan, nicknamed the furniture capital of the world. Like the tables and chairs that once poured out of the town's factories, a sturdy, reliable kind of place.
Some people call it a big, small town where a lot of people know each other.
Among its many claims, former President Gerald Ford grew up here.
It's a conservative Midwestern town. It's a pretty law enforcement-oriented community with not a whole lot of crime. Serious crime, anyway.
That is, until one frosty day in the fall of 1992.
You don't expect something like that to happen. At least I never did. And it's disturbing to everybody.
On the northeast part of town, a housing development is under construction. At lunchtime, a worker takes a break in a nearby apple orchard.
One of the construction workers on his noon hour was going out collecting apples for a deer blind. It was very much off the beaten track, except for those that were working there.
As he gathers the fallen fruit, he spots something suspicious.
One of them came across what at first he thought was a mannequin and came closer and closer. Then realized there was a body.
Grand Rapids detectives Dave Nowakowski and John Denvor race to the scene.
I thought it was possibly a hunter, got shot, or had a heart attack, something along that line.
What he discovers is far more shocking.
You could see a body through the brush. All I could tell was a white female, approximately 15 years old.
She was pretty much covered. It was long grass that had been cut up and just some branches and so forth, and it covered her whole body.
The body was nude except for a small, like, ankle bracelet. No clothes around the area, nothing. She had a mark across her neck, like from a belt.
It was October, and in Michigan you get really cold nights, so that helped as far as the preservation of the body.
Detectives comb the apple orchard looking for clues.
Mike Nowakowski and I, and at least one other police officer, walked the orchard and the buildings, the construction site, just looking for anybody that may have seen anything that looked like a crime scene. And we found nothing. We found nothing that indicated anything had happened there.
When you have a young person that dies, it's shocking. I mean, you don't expect something like that to happen.
For detectives, task number one is to identify the naked victim. A search of missing persons reports turns up a local teen runaway.
We found out that Dina Gillian had been missing for, I believe it was a week.
She matched the description.
They suspected it was her, but they had to confirm it.
24 hours after the girl in the orchard is found, Coroner Stephen Cole confirms she's 15-year-old high school student Deanna Gillian.
She was well enough preserved that we performed the identification with fingerprints. What was unusual about this case is that we don't have very many cases of young women being strangled and dumped in the outdoors.
I was walking up to the house when the cops were standing there by the doors. And told me they found the body. So before I got in the house, I knew she was dead. That day was the end of my life. I had nothing for dinner.
Sam Gillian tells investigators that he hasn't seen his daughter in over a week. She vanished after a huge argument.
I had my girlfriend and her daughter over at the house. And we was watching TV, drinking a beer. And Dina was ready to go to bed, and William was going to bed, so I wanted Dina to babysit my girlfriend's daughter and let her sleep in there. And we got in an argument over that. And then Dina ran out the door.
She went to her girlfriend's house, which was a couple, 3 blocks away.
Deanna's best friend was Melissa Showman.
I received a phone call from Dina saying that her father had gotten an argument and could she come over to my house. I asked her if she had wanted to play cards, but she was really upset. I think she just needed somebody to be there and talk to her.
Deanna stayed at Melissa's house for about an hour and left around 12:30 a.m. Melissa was the last person to see the 15-year-old alive.
I expected Dina to just go home and would see her at school, and she never called.
Dina disappeared off the face of the earth, and that was all anybody knew.
I feel like if there would have been just one thing I could have said or done to keep her there or to walk home with Dina, this wouldn't have happened.
Coroner Stephen Cole estimates that Deanna's body had been in the orchard for several days.
We can ballpark the time of death, and we look for a number of things: rigidity, lividity, occasionally body temperature, discoloration of the abdomen. So I thought 3 to 4 days prior to when she was found dead was a reasonable estimate as to her time of death.
Her injuries suggest she fought until her dying breath.
I believe that there was a considerable struggle. There were scrapes on her back, which would be consistent with her being on the ground. The fact that she had been punched in the mouth would be an indicator that the assailant is trying to slow her up and decrease her degree of struggling.
Detectives returned to Deanna's house and search her bedroom for clues.
We did go into the room and look for different things. Notes she read, or diary, anything like that.
What she had in her scrapbook was sort of like a snapshot of the times and what teenagers are doing in that time. You know, she had the stuff from Wayne's World, and she had, Doogie Howser stuff. So she seemed like a typical 15-year-old.
But detectives know things aren't always what they seem. They wonder if clues lie in her background. Deanna's parents divorced when she was 6. Her mother stayed in Texas. Deanna and her older brother moved with her father to a rundown part of Grand Rapids.
She was as perfect of a daughter as I could have asked for. When she was growing up, she was always smiling and laughing and cutting up with people, and she always liked to play around. She could walk in a room full of sourpusses in 15 minutes, have them all laughing.
Dina was an honor student. She didn't have to study very hard to get good grades. It just automatically came to her.
Deanna had dreams of becoming a teacher. She had friends. She went to church. Everything about her life seemed full of promise. except for one thing. Her father was a drinker, a heavy drinker.
Our first struggle with the father was his intoxication. It was hard to find him at a time when he was sober enough to just talk with us. As far as his willingness to cooperate with us on a scale of 1 to 10, I think his willingness was about a 5 or 6. His ability was about a 2 or a 3.
Detectives learned that the argument between father and daughter had been so violent, neighbors called the police.
We looked at the situation that happened at home. He was a contributing party to it, so you have to look at it from that angle too. He was looked at as a suspect.
To make matters worse, it's what Sam Gillian didn't do that really concerns the detectives. He waited a few days before reporting his teenage daughter missing.
I thought she probably was with somebody else for a couple days. And then finally I went down and turned in a missing persons report to the police.
That when something happens like that, probably the first place you're going to look at is the family. Is something happened here that got out of control?
Get the hell in the car. His last words were an argument with his daughter, and he quickly became a suspect. I mean, the police were looking at him because of that argument.
I was just worried half to death. You know, I was scared. But I never had that much faith in the cops, so I didn't go down there right away. What would they have done anyway?
Detectives aren't buying Sam Gillian's explanation. To them, it's a flimsy excuse from a father whose daughter had been missing for days. A month shy of her 16th birthday, Deanna Gillian is found dead in a Michigan apple orchard.
Here's a 15-year-old walking home from a friend's house, and all of a sudden, she disappears. That is the worst nightmare of a parent.
News of the schoolgirl's brutal murder puts all of Grand Rapids on edge.
You've got a body found. She's naked. The thought is that there's some rapists running around there killing teenagers. So, you know, there was some fear in the community.
Detectives have a different take on the body in the orchard.
She was abducted, strangled, and hid. You have to keep an open mind. Was it her dad?
They basically told him, you're just a drunk, and you're a drunk who killed your daughter. I mean, that was the accusation.
Detective Denboer combs Sam Gillian's car for clues and finds some telltale mud on the wheel.
We knew at the site that there was fresh dirt that had been dug up and fresh dirt on the roadway. You can take mud off the tires or the fender wells and so forth, compare it with the mud that's found at the scene.
Meanwhile, the autopsy results come in.
She didn't have any definitive evidence of sexual assault. I didn't see any evidence of forcible sexual assault, which does not rule it out. The marks on her neck were nonspecific. What she had that also was consistent with the strangulation were innumerable pinpoint hemorrhages around the eyes and actually on the lining of the eye. In my opinion, something like a small rope could have been used, an extension cord, but there wasn't enough for a pattern to be identifiable.
Detectives wonder if, fueled by booze and rage, Sam Gillian strangled his daughter, then staged her body to make it appear as a sex crime.
Was it a rape, or was it something to make it look like a rape because she was nude? Did he take her clothes? So, geez, I made a missing report on her. What if I take her clothes? Maybe the body will rot away and nobody ever see her again.
The cops went and talked to my girlfriend and asked her if I was a sexual pervert, if I liked to hurt her when we had sex. I ain't a pervert.
Deanna's dad is grilled by the detectives.
How about fighting? Is that normal?
The father denied any knowledge of it. Said he was home all evening.
Dean and I got along just fine. And that was the first argument like that we had ever had.
Investigators don't believe Sam Gillian's story, and they put him through a lie detector.
It's a good gauge of someone's guilt or innocence.
Well, I knew I was going to have to take one because I was her father. You know, when a kid's murdered like that or disappears, they're always going to suspect the father.
Deanna's father passes the test. On top of that, lab results revealed the mud on his car didn't come from the apple orchard.
Once you've eliminated the car, once you've eliminated as far as time and so forth, then the person is pretty much out of the scope of a suspect.
If Sam Gillian didn't kill his daughter, who did? 7 days after she was found, investigators are back to square one. And then, a lead.
A guy named Kerry Bogue was headed to work really early in the morning and noticed a red station wagon parked with the tailgate open and nobody around, and I believe the light still on in the car.
He called in and said this red wagon was up there. Right away I suspected him because he was so close to where she lived. And he was at the site, which is a long ways from her home. And I mean, strange coincidence, but boy, it put him in the ballgame.
The tipster himself is now under suspicion.
All of a sudden, they were questioning him as a suspect. So he got pulled into it, way more than he wanted to.
Bogue takes a lie detector test and passes. He's free to go. His information on the red station wagon is filed away and forgotten. 2 weeks after Deanna's nude body was found in the orchard, her murder remains a mystery.
I figured it would be a long time before they found out who really did it, because whoever did it was going to keep their mouth shut.
It was just this total mystery, and they kept repeatedly reaching out for tips. And this unsolved mystery, and really it not going anywhere at all. They weren't identifying suspects. They weren't, coming forward with anything like that.
Detectives take a closer look at the teen's friends and acquaintances. Maybe there lies a clue to what happened to Deanna Gillian that chilly autumn night.
You start digging into friends, and we tried to trace the last month or so of her life as to where she was, what type of things she would do.
Dina was down at the church 4 or 5 times a week without me taking her down there.
It was almost like she was rising above, her environment, like she was going to make something better.
Deanna may be a model daughter, but her brother Billy is a different story.
Billy, he was like 3 years older. I think he was 18 at the time. And he liked to drink, and he liked to party. Pot parties and stuff like that. And he got into some trouble with the law.
We found that while she came from a very difficult family situation, she herself didn't fit. Her circle of friends were entirely different than her brothers and her father's, just totally opposite of what the element that normally hung around her house.
Deanna's brother and his pals are no strangers to trouble.
They've been running as a group of thieves, basically. They would break into cars 2 or 3 nights a week. They would go out and hit 30, 35 cars a night and steal stereos. Typically, they would steal it, sell it, and then party with the money. And that was pretty much their lifestyle.
On the night Deanna vanished, Billy's gang had been partying.
We never could get really good answers. And just more and more dealing with them, we became more and more suspicious of them because of the type of people they were.
The group's ringleader is Francis Littell. The 20-year-old has a history with the police.
Francis Littell was a friend of her brother Billy's, and they partied together. They drink and smoke pot together.
Dina would tell me that they're typical boys, and that they were sometimes rude or sometimes made comments to her about being pretty or hot.
As far as Francis's feelings for Dina, my impression was Francis says if you wore a skirt or even looked like you did, he was interested. Even made it known that he wanted to get with her, but she, according to the people we talked to, she never would have anything to do with him.
The police wonder if Deanna ran into Littell and the gang on her way home. Maybe what started out as an attempted rape turned into murder.
We were starting to zero in on Francis Littell because he wanted to have his way with Dina.
They were good suspects because they were close to the victim's family. Their activities were such that, you know, a lot of drug use, alcohol, the theft. Francis Littell became the one that everybody looked at.
It's been several weeks since Deanna Gillian, a promising high school student, was found naked and strangled in an abandoned orchard. Investigators in Grand Rapids have her older brother's friend, Francis Littell, in their sights.
Littell made comments that he was attracted to her and would like to get together with her.
What you try to do is establish where people were, try to put that into time frames that you know are important to the case.
Maybe if you told us more information.
Had nothing to do with it. Didn't kill her. I aim to God.
Littell, as I recall, didn't want to give us much information. Said he didn't do it, and that's about it.
Is your name Francis Littell?
But he does agree to take a polygraph.
Yes.
And he passes. It looks like another dead end. And then, detectives receive a damning piece of information. Information that moves Littell right back to the top of their suspect list.
His girlfriend told us that she had heard him make a statement. He had been sitting on the front porch at the time and she was in the house, and it implied that he was the one that killed Dina. She wouldn't do me, so I did her.
To the detectives, it sounds a lot like a confession to attempted rape and murder.
The detectives were pretty certain that they had the right guy. I mean, this Francis Littell, you know, he had been at the house, been partying. You know, someone overheard something that somebody else had said.
We didn't find anything to support it. Their alibis that night were that they were together, and they were at a party.
Life for murder suspect Francis Littell has now become a living nightmare.
He hadn't been identified publicly as a suspect. What was happening to him was he had people break into his house, and he jumped out a window because they were going to lynch him, because they were going after the guy they thought was responsible.
Francis Littell wouldn't talk to us anymore. I went to his house, banged on the door, put cards on the door to have him call us for employment, this type of thing, and which were ignored. Said, well, why? Why isn't he not talking to us?
They wouldn't quit pounding him. He finally had to get a lawyer to keep the cops off of him.
Seven months pass, and the search for Deanna's killer is stalling. With nothing new on Francis Littell, the detectives look elsewhere for suspects.
Police in Grand Haven sent out a bulletin to all neighboring police departments saying, if you've got any unsolved sexual assaults, rapes, you might want to look at this guy. He's been living in Grand Rapids. You know, he drives this burgundy station wagon. You might want to check out Robert Ladwig.
Robert Ladwig has just been picked up in nearby Grand Haven for stalking young women on a beach.
The guy was weird. I remember that about him. I believe there were 3 girls who had skipped school and gone to the beach. And this Ladwig showed up and started verbally suggestive remarks to them.
Detectives search his station wagon and find local maps with schools highlighted, including Deanna's.
This guy was working as some bookseller and was actually making drops at schools, but it was kind of curious that he was actually had maps with schools marked on them.
His vehicle was a red station wagon, but there's a lot of red station wagons out there, and I didn't have a lot of information. There was no criminal background check available. He was not under arrest. He was cooperative with us, so it really didn't rise to the top other than taking the information and keeping it and going on from there. We had no reason to hold him, so we let him go.
They let him go because detectives don't believe a stranger attacked Deanna. And there's no conclusive evidence she was sexually assaulted. Ladewig's M.O.
The police had a lot of dead-end leads. It was pretty frustrating knowing that somebody killed my best friend and they had no idea who did it.
Almost 2 years go by with little progress. And then another promising lead. A friend of Deanna's brother, Gordy Bush, now in jail, wants to talk to the police.
Gordy, he said he knew where the crime happened, and he would take us there. Having the group to work with of Billy's friends and her associates, he was right in the middle of all of that and seemed to know everything that was going on.
If he's telling the truth, it's the break detectives desperately need. Bush says the scene of the crime is an empty apartment.
We drove him to the apartment, which was only 2 or 3 doors from Dina's home, and took us into the apartment. And the apartment had been vacant during the crime, which was where the kids were using as a party house.
Bush gives investigators a blow-by-blow account of how Deanna was murdered.
She was killed in this apartment and dragged down these bottom stairs. We had Mr. Bush there with us to show us that. From what he said at the time, he had been in that apartment at one time or another, so we felt he was telling the truth.
In a surprising twist, the jailhouse informer doesn't accuse the prime suspect, Francis Littell. Instead, he points the finger at his friend, Eric Vogel.
He said he came in at one time and Dina was sitting on the floor, and then later he came back because there was a disturbance, and he came in and he saw Vogel strangling Dina. We concluded that she probably encountered some of the kids from the party. This apartment would have been the perfect place to go. That made all the sense in the world.
A forensics team scours the abandoned apartment for clues.
Detective Denbour and I went over that apartment with a fine-tooth comb. Could find absolutely nothing. No blood, no trace evidence, absolutely nothing.
With nothing concrete to back up the snitch, the case stalls. Deanna Gillian's murder is filed away. It's now an unsolved homicide.
It was just so convoluted. It was just so frustrating with all the lies and all the work we put into it.
I think it's just one of these stories that kind of got tucked away. The people closest to it obviously were on edge, and the people who the police were going after were clearly on edge, but the whole community wasn't. It had just, I think, really been pretty much forgotten.
I had no future. I didn't have anything to look forward to anymore. So I didn't really give a damn about nothing or nobody for a long time.
11 years go by, and it looks like the mystery of who killed Deanna Gillian will never be cracked. Then, a grand jury in Grand Rapids convenes to look into unsolved homicides.
There were like 20 shootings and murders. It was a high year for Grand Rapids, and they were all related to the same guns, the same gangs. So that was why the grand jury was set up. We got done early with that, and so we had 6 more months. So they said, why don't we bring some of these old cases back in, and Dina Gillian was one of them.
Kelly Konski and her team of homicide detectives re-examine the case. They agree with the original investigators.
We believe it's Littell and that group, some combination of those people that were closest to her and her brother.
We thought that it was probably this inner group. There just needs to be something else to compel them to testify and truthfully tell us what happened, and we thought the grand jury would do that.
Subpoenas are sent to Deanna's brother Billy and his gang. They all must testify at the grand jury.
This is our one opportunity to really solve this, really tell people what happened to this poor girl. We all believed the whole motive for this was sex, that this was a sex offense gone wrong, turned to murder.
But after all this time, can a stone-cold case be brought back to life? 11 years have passed since high school student Deanna Gillian was strangled to death and dumped in a Grand Rapids apple orchard. Her father is still searching for answers.
When you hear these people say it only takes once for your child to do something like that and they get killed, that's all it takes is once.
You don't always have a victim like a teenage girl who did nothing to deserve this. I mean, nothing. This is like truly one of our innocent victims. This is like a case worth working.
A grand jury is re-examining her murder. Investigators go back to prison informant Gordy Bush.
He was nervous about being put on in front of a grand jury about, testifying, because now he knew that anything he said was going to be reviewed by this judge. And grand jury's not built to make people feel comfortable. The grand jury is built to get people to tell the truth.
Gordy Bush told more than one story about what happened to the victim. Gordy Bush first blamed it on Vogel. And then when we pressured and really tried to test Gordy's statements, all of a sudden he flips to Francis Littell. I wasn't completely truthful, it was Littell.
The investigator's prime suspect is now back in play.
When Gordy Bush was changing suspects, there were some red flags. That something's not right here, maybe we're not looking in the right place, but not enough to abandon the original group. A case was building that either Littell or Vogel did this.
In March 2004, the grand jury begins hearing testimony.
It was, double top secret. They had, courtroom windows with cardboard covering the glass, and they're going till 11 at night, having these long sessions.
Originally started with that core group of friends, hoping that someone might say something that was different than they had provided originally.
What we were running into is no one is telling us that Littell or Vogel are involved in this.
A troubling possibility starts to nag the prosecution. Maybe the jailhouse snitch is lying. On the stand, he makes a startling admission.
He basically changed his whole story, said he had made it up because, trying to get some sweet deal from the police or the courts.
There's part of you that wants to go, no, you're just trying to protect your friends now, or no, you just don't want everyone to know that you snitched them out. But in the end, it was clear to all of us that these people didn't do it.
None of this group had anything to do with this murder, because it was all based on a bunch of lies.
I was disappointed because I felt like we were finally getting close enough to give this family closure. It was a wake-up call. It was we're not looking in the right place.
Gordy Bush is sentenced to 10 years in jail for perjury. For Francis Littell, his 11-year nightmare is finally over.
I found out that I was no longer a suspect, and it was like someone just took a mountain off my shoulder. I felt like they took my life away. No matter how long after it had happened, and probably within the next 10, 20, 30 years, am I going to forget? No, I am not going to forget.
For the grand jury, the clock is ticking. Unless investigators can come up with something new, the murder may never be solved.
We're back to ground zero now. So where do we go from here?
And we came back to the conference room here at the police department, and I remember sitting down with Kelly and saying that, we need to go over some things again.
So when I went back and looked at the case, I don't know if I really expected to find anything, but I thought at least we'd find someone else to bring in grand jury. Something else to look at. You know, outside the box, who else could this possibly be if it wasn't that group?
In a last-ditch attempt, prosecutor Kelly Konski plows through the original paperwork looking for clues. She notices a plain brown envelope.
There was a file sitting out that detectives have left for me, and there was a manila envelope in there. And I think it said Grand Haven Police or something like that on it, and it's kind of nondescript, but, you know, if I was going to go through every paper, I was going to look at this thing, and I open it up, and I read this, and then I talks about a red station wagon, and there's pictures, and it's a repeat sex offender who preys on young girls nearby. And his address at the time is in close proximity to where our victim disappeared and where she was killed. And the last offense that he was picked up for was trying to snatch young girls off the street into his red station wagon.
The man Kelly Konski is staring at is Robert Ladewig. 11 years ago, he was briefly a suspect.
It was shock, but almost a little disheartening to think, boy, it's been right here. And why haven't we done anything? You know, it's like, I can't believe this is here right now.
Investigators traveled to neighboring Grand Haven, where Ladewig committed several sex crimes.
I went with Detective Needham to see if they had any photographs left. Had they processed the vehicle when they caught Ladewig with that vehicle perping on young girls over there?
The police there had gotten rid of all the evidence from his station wagon because it had been years earlier. And they'd gotten rid of, you know, this blanket he supposedly had in his station wagon. All that evidence was gone, so they had nothing to tie him. No DNA.
Detectives are shocked to discover Ladewig has a long rap sheet for raping and kidnapping young girls.
The crimes that he had been in prison for were similar from a sexual standpoint, and it was just eerie in how closely it could match up with Deanna Gillian.
Ladewig is serving a 10 to 30-year sentence for unrelated sex crimes.
I mean, the more you got into his past, this guy, I mean, I'll tell you, he's every parent's nightmare.
Detectives Betts and Needham pay him a visit.
He's probably 6'3" or 6'4", and real kind of bony. I can't say where the feeling came from, but it was definitely that this guy just had this weird presence.
Goes by the name Lurch, and he kind of looks like a lurch. I guess if you can picture what a lurch would look like. It's a strange-looking man.
Robert Ladewig is much too eager for the detective's liking.
He was asking us a lot of questions, which immediately puts us on the defensive.
He was real inquisitive about, why are you talking to me about this? And we were both highly suspicious of that.
So we were very careful to not let him in on too much.
Ladewig is looking more and more like a viable suspect in the killing of Deanna Gillian. Detectives delve into his family background by questioning his sister.
Bob was mad at the world, and he was going to take something from it because he felt he didn't have what he deserved.
Joan tells the detectives her brother began stealing as a teenager. As he grew older, he graduated from shoplifting to sexual assault.
Sometimes something would just come over Bob, and he would take a girl. And he knew it was wrong. Bob would look for a girl and take one. But I think Bob really wanted a girlfriend, a nice life. But then he had this other side going on with him. Bob could be very charming and manipulative because that served him well with these girls. He was a good con artist.
He looks like a good suspect, but we don't have any proof. And even with a grand jury, if he's not willing to talk, there's not a lot the grand jury is going to be able to do.
Let's follow this to the end. It may be a dead end also, but let's start here and follow it to the end and see where it takes us.
Ladewig fell through the net 11 years ago. Investigators are determined if he killed Deanna, he won't escape justice again. 11 years after 15-year-old Deanna Gillian was strangled to death in Michigan, cold case investigators bring convicted sexual offender Robert Ladewig in front of a grand jury.
And he comes into the grand jury and he kind of denies everything. He denies any involvement in this case, but agrees that he'll take a polygraph, lie detector test if we want to.
It was at that point, too, that when you have no witnesses, it's difficult. So, you go from this elation or exuberance to now thinking, well, gosh, he looks like a good suspect, but we don't have any proof. And even with a grand jury, if he's not willing to talk, there's not a lot the grand jury is going to be able to do.
If Ladewig won't confess, then prosecutors have no case.
Unless we could find some physical evidence to connect him, we were going to be right where we were when we started.
In solitary confinement, Ladewig finally cracks.
My brother went back to his cell and put his arms up as if to strangle somebody, and he said, I put my arms up trying to think what it would be like to strangle somebody. And then Bob said he got a flash of what it would be like, and he got a flash that he did it, and he could remember. And so then he knew he was the murderer.
He admits to being involved in her death, of killing her.
I looked at my detectives like, what? Because we didn't expect that. I certainly didn't expect that.
But he's only willing to tell us certain things, like the actual murder. He won't talk about any sexual activity. He doesn't want to tell us about everything that happened because it'll have an impact on him as far as his sentence goes and his placement in prison.
He knows the system, and he also knows that if he admits to everything, he's going to prison, for life without parole. And so he's just trying to lessen his involvement to get a little shorter time in prison.
He'll say that he had a dream or he had this recollection came back. I don't believe that at all. I think he knew all along.
He knew about that he left her in a secluded area and put some sticks over her, and that he remembers her bottom was, her naked bottom was sticking out. Who remembers something like that if you didn't see it? I mean, that's a detail, and it's exactly how one of the photographs that we have from the scene depicts her. We never showed him anything. We didn't show him a photograph. We didn't tell him about where it happened or when it happened before he came in here. For him to be able to, in his mind, visualize the last time he saw this young girl that he killed was pretty compelling to me and to the detectives.
In one last move to seal the case, investigators look at items taken from Ladewig's apartment that his sister's been holding.
I asked the detectives to look through everything he has there.
She had a couple of boxes of stuff that she had removed from his apartment back when he got arrested on the case in Grand Haven.
And one of the things they found were a couple rings, women's rings.
The sister says, these rings I found on my brother's nightstand when I cleaned out his apartment.
Detectives need to identify the rings, so they call Deanna's friend, Melissa Showman, to the grand jury.
I get chills when I think about it. I showed her the two rings. She picked up that ring, and she looked at it.
I knew right away that one of the rings that they had there was Dina's.
It's enough to convince prosecutors they finally have their killer.
Between Ladewig's details about what he envisioned, what he last remembers seeing her and how she looked, the ring was more than enough to convince everyone that he was guilty.
On August 26, 2004, Ladewig pleads guilty to second-degree murder. After more than 11 years, the terrible mystery of who killed Deanna Gillian is solved. The police piece together what they believe happened. After leaving her best friend's house, Deanna is spotted walking 2 miles from her home.
He would say repeatedly, well, I picked her up in front of a building with windows all across the front. I pulled her into the car.
The police suspect Ladewig then held her hostage at his apartment.
What I believe, and I think my detectives believe, is that he had her for a while and abused her.
At some point, he drove Deanna to the apple orchard.
He thought she was passed out in the car. And then she tried to escape. And he claims that that's when he felt he had to strangle her. He tells us that he didn't mean to kill her, and he says he remembers looking at her body after he strangled her, thinking, gosh, what a pretty girl, what a waste.
I don't understand how people like Robert kidnap and murder somebody can live with themselves. They must not have a conscience. And I don't understand how somebody can live without a conscience like that and then just keep right on living like nothing happened.
He killed this poor girl because he didn't want to go to prison. But he's there anyway, so he didn't have to kill her. It's such a horrible shame.
Robert Ladewig receives a 25 to 60-year sentence.
And the reason that Ladewig had a hard time with some of the details is not because he doesn't remember her. He remembers exactly how he looked when he last saw her. It's hard for him because he's had so many. And that is how I feel about that man.
I just sort of found it amazing that they were looking at a guy like Francis Littell, who, you know, had an assault, and really not looking at this Robert Ladewig, who, you know, had this incredibly long history of raping, kidnapping, holding women hostage, all kinds of stuff. For one thing, I don't understand why he wasn't locked up a long time ago and just the key wasn't thrown away. I mean, he was that bad of a guy.
18 years later, Deanna Gillian's murder still haunts those caught up in the tragedy.
It's a nightmare for my family. It's a nightmare for the victims' families. It's a nightmare how one life can ripple through so many areas.
The Grand Rapids Police Department detectives still owe me an apology. Am I ever going to get it? No. Will I feel a lot better when I do? Yes. I am not going to forget. There's just no way you could forget